I'm doing a presentation on George Kelly. The direction said we can do a presentation on somebody that we will cover in class, so I'm assuming we're going to cover this man. He's very influential in psychology. So, his young life. Born in 1905, his dad was a preacher. He experienced the Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, and World War II. I'm going to talk about that later and how that influences psychological theories. His schooling, he had no formal education until the age of 13, never graduates high school, but then, he'll just grab a bachelor's in math and physics because he was going to become an engineer. But then he changed his mind, no, I'm going to get a master's in sociology now. And then he gets a PhD, but that's later. After his master's, he goes and teaches public speaking to labor organizers and bankers, and then citizenship classes to immigrants. It's kind of cool because it's around the Industrial Revolution. He's teaching those European immigrants. Then he moves to Iowa, starts teaching and coaching at drama at a junior college. This is really important because this is where he started his construct theory, which I'll talk about in a little bit. His fellowship at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland is where he received a Bachelor's of Education in Psychology. Eventually he ditched psychoanalytic thought, but that was when he got a job working for the Navy, which I'll talk about in like 2 seconds. So after he got his PhD, he develops his theory some more at a Kansas State college, and then he goes and works for the Navy. He's an aviation psychologist, and he starts developing some training programs for their pilots. After that, after the war's over, he goes and becomes the director of clinical psychology at Ohio State, and this is where he spent the bulk of his career. He matured his theories, and then he writes the Psychology of Personal Constructs. And then later on in his life, about 2 years before he passes away, he begins research at the Brandeis University, and that's where Maslow worked, which is pretty cool. Oh, it's also important to note that, no, I'll get to that later. Every man is, in his own particular way, a scientist. Some words of wisdom from George Kelly. As you can see in the diagram, you got hypothesis, and then observation and experiment that leads to theory, and then kind of comes back around on itself on hypothesis. That's on the left, and then you go on the right, and it's got the more socialistic approach with anticipation, experience and behavior, and construct system. Everyone is a scientist. We just said that, but more specifically, Kelly thought that humans attempted to predict and explain the future via constructs, which are determined based on observation and interpretation of your environment. What is a construct? I've been talking about it for like 5 minutes. Finally, you get to know its ways of construing events or seeing the world in order to anticipate the future to the best of your ability. I'm going to stick with ways of construing events. Seems basic and captures the definition pretty well. Personality, it's just basically the organized system of constructs. So just, yeah. And then this is where he gets his theory, personal construct theory. It's a combination of the two concepts, which gives rise to his fundamental postulate. And this is a quote, another gracious quote. A person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. Kind of regurgitating what I've been saying, this next bullet point, how you see the world creates channels that are future-oriented. This is just the same way of saying the same thing over and over, that you perceive the way that your world is. Anyways, the fundamental postulate also gets that you're pulled along through life by predictions and not pushed by the unconscious, the way Freud suggested. But I'm going to get into that later. Alright, so the characteristics of constructs. There's a lot of characteristics of constructs. Like, I didn't even list them all because there's just too many. I'm going to start with the basic of it all. So you have subordinate, or superordinate, and then subordinate. The superordinate is basically stating that you got the most important constructs and then the least important constructs. So whatever that is for you, whether you trust is your most important thing or not, or something else. And then there's always two opposite poles. So to go back, there's emergent and implicit. So to go back to the trust, you have trust would be emergent, and non-trust would be implicit. It's like good and bad in essence. Then you have range of convenience, like how convenient is that construct? Is it around, or do you have to look to find it? And then, where does that construct show up? Does it show up with your friends, with your family? Does it show up at school? Certain environments. And a construct is only as useful as the degree of predictability it provides. And so then you have the tight versus loose construct. Tight constructs, they're able to predict better than loose constructs, naturally. And you have a dependency construct, like, for example, that would be like your mom or dad, but we use mom. And that's the way that children all see the world through. That's my mom, that's not my mom. And the best thing about constructs, I think, is that they're cross-cultural. Because they're open-minded and content-free, there's no restrictions on the culture, because a construct is in your mind, and so there's no real barrier there. Are constructs permanent? No. I'm not going to leave you wondering the whole slide. Constructive alternativism is the idea that present interpretations are able to be altered. So basically, your personality in George Kelly's mind must change with its environment. And he believes that you can even revise, adapt, and construct your system to relieve negative emotions such as anxiety or fear. And this idea empowers the individual. I mean, they can acknowledge how they construe events, how they perceive the world, and they can trace their patterns of thought and possibly even alter them. Therapy and REP. REP stands for Role Construct Repertory Test. It's a construct system assessment, or fancy way of saying personality test. During this personality test, you list your constructs, and then they list, you can see it in the background, they list people in your social environment, and then you kind of rate them. There's another way of doing it as well, where you list your roles oriented to each person in your environment. And then George Kelly also had this fixed role therapy, where a client plays a role that he believes is the opposite construct of himself, and he sees how that feels, which is it's all interesting. It really has this emphasis on roles because it has to do with expectations, and that has to do with how you construct your environment, according to George Kelly. So, how did his theories come about? Well, as I noted earlier, he grew up in a very important time for natural disasters, and his theory was heavily influenced by natural disasters, and he said, forget you on operant conditioning and psychoanalytic theory. He was just like, dude, those don't matter, because his environment of World War II, Great Depression, and the Roaring 20s, like, you go from awesome to terrible to war. It has a big impact on somebody, and this is probably why he focused on thinking. It says that in the book, but that's a great idea. I love the idea, that notion that he had to separate himself from reality somehow and focus on the future instead of on the present, and that's why he's more future oriented. I think that's cool. So what would he say about my personality? This is really difficult because, like I said, it's open-ended, it's very vague. He'd probably say that I'm the type of person to avoid answering questions like this, so I'm maybe avoidant, secretive. I don't really like putting my stuff on blast. Not to sound like a jerk or something, or self-conscious, but okay, to be honest with you, I would probably refer to myself as somebody that's I'm religious, so it's important. It's important to me. That's probably my most super oriented construct, and that's what George Kelly would say. My worldview is largely shaped by that. All right, so George Kelly's theory and my mom. I don't want to go into too much detail, but okay, let's say like me, she's a Christian, so that's probably her most super orient area. But then she has her authoritarian. She's obsessed with rules, and so I mean, it's kind of contradictory from Christianity. A lot of people think that you're supposed to be obsessed with rules, but it's actually all about grace. Anyways, um, then there's trust. For her, it's probably a very important concept also because of her most super oriented construct, which is, this spirituality, Christianity. And then it's respect, and then it's value. And so, all these things kind of stem from this one initial thing, which is Christianity. And it's very important to note that the way that they run is very um, traditional with the socialization within that realm, if that makes any sense. So, what's different about Freud and our buddy George Kelly? Well, if you read that quote, I don't think that George Kelly really likes Freud very much. He completely rejected psychoanalytic thought. However, he has the theory of opposites, which it resembles Freud, it resembles Jung, it resembles so many people. I mean, just the ancient Chinese yin and yang. Everybody talks about this theories of opposites, But he didn't believe in this push and pull. It's more of just pull in different polarities. And he's not a stage theorist like Freud. He doesn't believe that stuff. Comparison with Rogers, they were both concerned with creativity, which I think is very important because it's kind of an under acknowledged form of intelligence. Anyways, they both argued that therapists shouldn't limit themselves to traditional methods and that individuals have choices of how they perceive the world. They also saw clients more like partners than patients, and this is a really big concept for Kelly. Is he saw himself as an equal to his patients, his clients, and I'm pretty sure that Rogers was on the same page. Ironically, Kelly was employed at the same position as Rogers at Ohio State, so Rogers leaves and then Kelly comes, so it's pretty cool. Impact and contributions. He's often described as one of the first cognitive theorists. His work was very important in the beginning of the cognitive movement in psychology, and that overall is just very important in psychology because the cognitive movement is huge today. It's so impactful. He also played an important role in the development of clinical psychology through his involvement in the APA in Ohio State. But I think the most important thing is his notion that everyone is a scientist because it played a crucial role in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think that this is the most important therapy that we should be focusing on is cognitive behavioral therapy with a mix of a strong drug. But I mean, that's just my opinion. Anyways, thanks for listening.